Good morning, everybody. It is good to see everybody here this morning. We've got some folks that have been traveling that are back with us, and we're glad to have you back home. We have visitors, and we're especially grateful for your presence with us this morning. I need to make one quick announcement before we jump into the lesson this morning. If you are interested in participating in our home Bible studies that are going to begin next month, if you signed up on the sheet, especially be here. If you did not sign up, it's okay. Still come. We want you to participate. We are going to meet briefly this morning after services. So give about 10 minutes or so, 10 or 15 minutes, just to be able to socialize and fellowship a little bit after services. And then if you would, just meet up here towards the front. And we will start sharing further details and kind of ironing out some of the logistics of those home Bible studies. So if you can stay this morning, we want everybody to participate. So whether you sign up or not, if you want to come, just be a part of the meeting with us this morning. All right. Danny Heatley. He was born January the 21st in 1981 in Canada. And I'm going to guess, like a lot of young boys growing up in Canada, he had a dream to play professional hockey. Well, unlike a lot of those boys, his dream actually came true. In 2000, he would be the second overall pick in the National Hockey League draft by the Atlanta Thrashers. The very next year, 2001 and 2002, he would make his professional hockey debut, and he would actually win Rookie of the Year for that year. The next year, 2003, he would be named the most valuable player in the National Hockey League All-Star Game. You see, everything seemed to be lining up perfectly for Danny Heatley. But then, on the night of September the 29th, 2003, his life would change forever. You see, that night, he would get behind the wheel of his Ferrari convertible with his teammate and closest friend, Dan Snyder, in the passenger seat. And as they were traveling through a residential area in Atlanta made up of curvy roads with a speed limit of 35 miles an hour, Heatley would be driving that Ferrari, some experts would say in excess of 80 miles an hour. He would lose control of the car, and he would smash into a brick wall and an iron fence. He would suffer multiple injuries from the wreck, but his best friend, Dan Snyder, would ultimately die 6 days later from his injuries. Heatley would go to court, and he would be sentenced to 3 years probation. He had to give 150 speeches as community service on the dangers of speeding. He was only allowed to drive to work, to the doctor's office, to shop, and for those speaking engagements. In addition, he was only able to own a car that would stay under a speed of 70 miles an hour. Now, I'm going to guess most of us, as we think about that sentence, would say that's not really that harsh in relationship to what happened. But here's what's interesting. The primary reason he got that sentence was due to the testimony of his best friend, Dan Snyder's family, his father specifically. I want you to notice what Dan Snyder's father said at trial. He said this. He said, as a parent, it's hard to explain how you feel about losing your son. My pride in Dan was immeasurable. We will miss him. So how do we move on from here? And listen to what he said. Forgiveness in our hearts has helped us to move on. We forgive Danny because he has shown remorse to our family. You think about those words with me for just a minute. Forgiveness in our hearts has helped us to move on. I'll be honest, I don't know how he got to this point. This was Graham Snyder after losing his son, but we understand there's power in forgiveness. The power in forgiveness allowed their family to move forward, but it also changed Danny Heatley's life in a profound way as well. You see, forgiveness is an important part of our lives as Christians. I think we understand that without forgiveness, we would ultimately be lost, literally lost. But yet extending forgiveness to other people is many times easier said than done, isn't it? It's hard. It has its challenges, but yet it's what you and I as Christians are called to do as we are supposed to imitate Christ. So how do we do all this? What can we understand about this word forgiveness, and how can we somehow gain an understanding and an appreciation so that we are better able to live this out in our lives? I invite you to turn to Matthew chapter 18 with me this morning. And I want us to look at a moment in the life and ministry of Jesus, and in this special parable that he would share with his apostles, that takes the idea of forgiveness and raises it to a completely different level. And let's see what lessons we can learn together. Let's start out by just reading Matthew chapter 18, beginning in verse 21. Then Peter came up and said to him, Lord, how often will my brother sin against me and I forgive him? As many as 7 times? Jesus said to him, I do not say to you 7 times, but 77 times. Therefore, the kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king who wished to settle accounts with his servants. When he began to settle, one was brought to him who owed him 10,000 talents. And since he could not pay, his master ordered him to be sold with his wife and children and all that he had, and payment to be made. So the servant fell on his knees, imploring him, Have patience with me, and I will pay you everything. And out of pity for him, the master of that servant released him and forgave him the debt. But when that same servant went out, he found one of his fellow servants who owed him 100 denarii. And seizing him, he began to choke him, saying, Pay what you owe. So his fellow servant fell down and pleaded with him, Have patience with me, and I will repay you. He refused and went and put him in prison until he should pay the debt. When his fellow servants saw what had taken place, they were greatly distressed. And they went and reported to their master all that had taken place. Then his master summoned him and said to him, You wicked servant, I forgave you all that debt because you pleaded with me. And should not you have had mercy on your fellow servant, as I had mercy on you? And in anger his master delivered him to the jailers until he should pay all his debt. So also my heavenly Father will do to every one of you if you do not forgive your brother from your heart. It's a powerful lesson, a powerful story that Jesus shares with Peter and the rest of the apostles. And as we think about this story, I want us to consider some things together. The first thing I want us to consider is this: the power of the question that Peter poses. But in order for us to really appreciate the question, I think we need to understand the backdrop of what's happening here that leads up to this particular question. You see, Matthew's gospel deals primarily with Jesus' ministry in Galilee. In Matthew chapter 4 and verse 12, Matthew records that Jesus sets off into Galilee. And from that particular verse to where we are right here, everything that occurs is Jesus' ministry in Galilee. But notice in chapter 19 and verse 1 what's about to happen. Now when Jesus had finished these sayings, he went away from Galilee and entered the region of Judea beyond the Jordan. You see, Jesus is finishing up his ministry here. In fact, this would be the last recorded words before Jesus is about to turn and set his eyes squarely on ultimately Jerusalem, the very place that was his primary focus from the beginning. But as Jesus is here in Galilee, he engages in ministry, and in Matthew chapter 18, the primary focus of the chapter is on the idea of how do these followers of Jesus live together in community of people, as his people. You see, the Jews, they had always had this sense of community as his people. But I would maybe argue a little bit that they had lost an element or sense of the importance of that community throughout history. As they left Egypt, they were this close-knit group of community of people. As they entered the Promised Land initially, they were close in this element of community. But then you think about just the course of history. As they were conquered by the Assyrians and the Babylonians, they would be dispersed in different areas. And then ultimately, Alexander the Great would rise to power, and they would continue to be dispersed and spread out to the point that their tight sense of community had waned somewhat over time. And so Jesus is talking about this new sense of community that would be experienced by His disciples, His followers, that would be a part of ultimately kingdom living. And we'll talk about that more in just a moment. So the chapter opens with this idea of who's the greatest in this community, an ongoing argument that had existed between the apostles. Mark's gospel would share just a little bit more detail about this account. You see, they were on the road in Galilee, and they enter the town of Capernaum. And they go to a house, more than likely even Peter's house. And they had been engaged in this discussion as they walked along the road. And so they enter the house, and Jesus simply asked them, "What have you been talking about?" But you see, they didn't want to answer Him, because what they had been talking about was this infighting and this arguing amongst themselves of who was the greatest. But Jesus already knew. He knew what they had been talking about. Can you imagine their faces here when Jesus takes a child and brings a child into their midst to illustrate to them who would be the greatest? You see, there needs to be a sense of humility that exists in living in community. But then, as we continue on, He talks about the temptation of sin and how that impacts community living. And then He shares the parable of the lost sheep and how important every single person is, even one soul in a community of God's people. But then beginning in verse 15, He starts talking about if a brother sins against you. In many ways, verses 15 through 20 are kind of a practical application of how those that live in community can actually live out the example of the parable of the prodigal son. The importance of one person. And it's this discussion in verses 15 through 20 that ultimately lead Peter to his question. You see, Peter moves away from the proverbial they, and he's thinking personally now. And I can't help but believe he's thinking about, how do I handle when one of my fellow apostles living with me in community offends me? You know, I think it's easy sometimes for us to think that as Jesus called His followers, they just all came together and everything worked in perfect harmony and they all got along because they were followers of Jesus. But that's not true. They came from different backgrounds. We're about to enter into our home Bible studies, and we're going to use the TV show The Chosen. And one of the things I love about that show, if you've watched any of it, is it kind of shows what the relationship might have been like between those disciples as they came together to live in community. And it wasn't always easy. There was some difficulty. There was some arguing. There was a little bit of jealousy at times, it would seem. And even their discussion about who's the greatest gives us some insight into the fact that it wasn't always easy. So maybe Peter in his mind is thinking, how do I handle when one of my brothers here sins against me? And so Peter poses the question, how often will my brother sin against me and I forgive him? That word forgive, the meaning of the word maybe on a simple level is this: to cancel or pardon, to wipe out. How many times do I have to cancel, pardon, completely wipe out something that one of my fellow disciples does against me? So Peter offers a number, and he says, 7 times? Now for us, I don't know what you think about that number. Maybe there's different things, but Peter had a purpose in it. Because you see, Peter had been taught more than likely, because what rabbis would teach is this: 3 times. 3 times is how much you forgive. Jewish rabbis would say, if someone commits a trespass against you, the first, the second, and the third time, forgive them. The 4th time, don't forgive them. That's more than likely what Peter had in his mind. So Peter thinks, I'm going to offer up this number that goes way further than what the rabbis have been teaching. I got to think in his mind, Peter thinks, I'm nailing this. I got it covered here. I'm going above and beyond. He says 7 times. But notice Jesus' answer. You see, Jesus gives a completely different number. Jesus says, Peter, how about 77 times? And it's not that Jesus is trying to tie a specific number. That number 77 really, I think the idea that Jesus is trying to get across here is completeness. You do it as many times as it takes in order for things to be complete and right between you and your brother. So let's pause for a moment. Let's just think about practical things that impact us in our lives. And maybe just from this brief beginning, when we think about the power of the question, one of the things that we realize is this: living in community is not easy, is it? We live in community within our homes. We have family community. We live in community as a church family. And the truth is, there are times it's just not easy. It's a shame, but it's a truth of life that it's those that are closest to us that many times have the ability to hurt us the most, isn't it? And as we live in community, whether it's in our homes or whether it's in church, there are times that we are going to be offended, where we have to extend forgiveness. And Peter's question is a fair question. How many times? You know, we have a saying in our culture that I guess most of us in this room have probably heard. Fool me once, shame on me. Fool me twice, shame on you, right? And the idea behind that saying is pretty simple. You do something to trick me, to take advantage of me once, well then that's on me. But I'm not going to let you do it a second time because I better learn from that first time. But I'm afraid that mentality has kind of trickled into our idea of forgiveness. Hurt me once, shame on you. Hurt me twice, shame on me. You see, you do it the first time, okay, but I'm not going to let you do it again. I'll make sure that I keep an arm's distance. I'll make sure that I set boundaries and parameters. And what we're about to learn is kingdom living has a whole different view of forgiveness. So let's consider the second part of this. Let's consider the parable. You think about parables. Parables were a common way that Jesus used to teach. But I want us to think a little bit about what is a parable. And maybe you've heard this definition. A lot of times we'll use this as we're teaching our children growing up. It's an earthly story with a heavenly meaning. And I think in some ways that's a good way to introduce the idea of a parable to a child. But I think we need to appreciate that to Peter and the rest of Jesus' audience, it was much, much more than that. It was far deeper than an earthly story with a heavenly meaning. I like N.T. Wright's description of what a parable is in his book, Simply Jesus. N.T. Wright would say this: parables are expressions of Jesus' shocking message that God's kingdom was arriving on earth as it was in heaven. They were stories designed to tease, to clothe the shocking and revolutionary message about God's kingdom in garb that would leave the listeners wondering, trying to think it out. I want you to think about it. I think there's a lot of truth in this. You see, Jesus was introducing kingdom living. That's what he was there to do, was introduce. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that phrase in just a moment. And what Jesus was calling his followers to was something completely different. Think about Peter's question. How many times? 7, Lord? Peter thought he was doing something great. Jesus is going to take that. He's going to turn it upside down and dump it all out on its head and say, Peter, you don't even understand. You see, the message, this parable that Jesus uses, he's putting clothes. He's helping Peter and the apostles see in real life what kingdom living is really about. And then he leaves them thinking, processing it through about how do I now take this and put it to use in my life and live this kingdom out. There was a sense that they had to wrestle with this understanding and teaching. And Jesus wants the same thing today. He wants us to take his teaching and wrestle with it. To wrestle with what it looks like in our lives, to actually live it out. You see, it's much more than just an earthly story with a heavenly meaning. It's meant to challenge and to elevate and to think about kingdom living and to clothe it in a way that we can see it and understand it and then wrestle out what it means to live it in our lives. So Jesus starts this parable by saying, therefore the kingdom of heaven. Key phrase in the book of Matthew. And it's an important phrase. Matthew is writing to a Jewish audience. And so we need to understand what might have been going through the mind of Peter and his apostles as Jesus uses this idea of the kingdom of heaven. And we're just going to think about two Old Testament verses. Both come from the book of Daniel. In Daniel chapter 2, in verse 44, Daniel records these words. And in the days of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that shall never be destroyed, nor shall the kingdom be left to another people. It shall break in pieces all these kingdoms and bring them to an end, and it shall stand forever. You see, this vision, there were earthly kingdoms that had risen to power and that would ultimately fall, and then a new one would rise and it would fall. And part of Daniel's prophecy was this: God's going to set up a kingdom, though, that will never be destroyed. So there's this idea, this seed that is being planted about God's kingdom. 2 chapters over, in Daniel chapter 4 and verse 3. How great are His signs, how mighty His wonders. His kingdom is an everlasting kingdom, and His dominion endures from generation to generation. These are just two examples. There are many more that we could go to from the Old Testament, from the Scriptures, that Peter and the apostles and the Jewish audience would have had in their minds. They were familiar with this concept of God's kingdom, that it was coming. Now, they misunderstood it, but what Jesus is here to say is that kingdom is here. I am ushering in that kingdom. God's rule on earth is about to exist in heaven. I'm here as God in flesh, and this kingdom is now. The time is now. But now let me introduce you to what kingdom living looks like. Because you see, it's going to be more radical. It's going to be more deep than anything you've ever imagined. Everything you thought you knew, I'm going to tell you. I'm going to take you to a different level. So he introduces some individuals that make up this parable. The king. The king ultimately will represent God. The first servant that owes the debt to the king. I think God is intending for Peter to see himself as that servant. And you and I, we need to see ourselves as that servant. And then the third servant that owes his debt to the fellow servant. That illustrates our connection between each other. It's our fellow brothers and sisters that share in this community living with us. So Jesus introduces the players in this parable, but there's something incredibly important that we have to understand, and that is the units of money that Jesus uses. So he talks about two different forms of money, the first being a denarii. I want us to consider that. A denarii was equal to 1 day's wages, specifically. A talent. A talent was the largest sum unit of money that existed. 1 talent was equal to 6,000 denarii, roughly 20 years worth of work by the average laborer. So let's put that in perspective now. This servant owes his king 10,000 talents. The point is, he owes him a debt that could not be repaid in 20 lifetimes. It was beyond anything that he would ever have the ability to repay. And so he comes, the servant or the king says, "It's time to pay up. I'm cashing in what you owe." Obviously, the servant doesn't have it. The king then is going to say, "All right, well then I'm going to get what I can. I'm going to sell you. I'm going to sell your entire family. I'm going to sell everything that you owe, and then that will be what I get in return." But I want you to notice some key words. These are critical words in this parable. I want you to notice this. The servant fell on his knees, imploring him, "Have patience with me." Patience is the first key word I want you to notice. The idea behind patience is this: it's bearing up under something that was undeserved. All right, so the servant begs for patience. The next key word is found in verse 27. The king's response, out of pity. Patience, pity is the second key word. The idea of being able to relate, having compassion, seeing the other person, putting yourself in their shoes. The next word is this: released him. Out of pity for him, the master of that servant released him. And then the fourth word is forgave. The idea behind both of those words are simply this: he pardoned him. He canceled it. He completely wiped the slate clean. He didn't say, I want you to give me what you can and we'll continue holding on to the rest of the debt and we'll figure out an extended payment plan. So we have these important words, the idea of patience and pity and release and forgive. And then the final important word is found in verse 33. He says, and should not you have had mercy on your fellow servant as I had mercy on you? You see, the servant begged for the king to have patience. Bear up, if you will, king, under me. I know you don't deserve what I have put you in, but I'm asking you to bear up under that with me. And as the king listened to him beg for patience, it elicited this sense of pity that caused him to have mercy, which ultimately resulted in him wiping the slate clean. Those are key words in the story. But then that servant, after he's been released, he now goes to the one that owes him money as well. And that particular servant owed him a debt that was equivalent to about 20 weeks worth of pay. So one debt was more than 20 lifetimes could have ever paid. This servant owed him 20 weeks. And instead of having patience and pity and mercy, and instead of wiping that debt clean, he chokes him and he has him thrown in prison because he wants what is rightfully his. He had every right to it. It was a legitimate debt. The one servant owed it, but he was not about to let a wrong go unpunished. So you think about the power of this parable. Obviously, what Jesus is trying to drive home is Peter needed to see himself as the one that could never repay his debt to God in 20 lifetimes. There was nothing that Peter could do or anybody else that would take care of the debt of sin. But yet the King, God, has patience. He bears up under our sin because you see, we're in the same boat Peter's in. Our debt couldn't be repaid in 20 lifetimes, but yet God bears up under the burden of sin, nothing He did, and He has pity on us. He shows compassion. And because of His mercy, He wipes the slate clean. He pardons. Wipes it clean. And so what's supposed to happen is Peter, you and me, are supposed to see ourselves in the forgiveness that God provides to us, and now we are supposed to take that in our lives and display and distribute and show that in how we forgive other people. But you see, I think there's one more important part of this story that helps really tie all of this together, and it's this. It's the power of Jesus. I think first it's just the power of Jesus in the moment here. In the power of His teaching as He is trying to help them understand what community living is going to require. You see, it's going to require some of the greatest sacrifice that you can imagine. It's not about who's going to be the greatest. It's going to be about humility and serving. It's going to be about resisting temptation. It's going to be about going after those that might have hurt you, that are in danger of being lost. And it's going to be all about forgiveness, even in those close personal relationships. But you see, here's what's amazing about Jesus. He doesn't just teach it, He lives it. He's going to live it out in the life with Peter. You see, just in a few short moments in his life, Peter is going to do one of the most regrettable things he ever did in his life. He's going to end up denying Jesus. And Luke would record for us in his account of that moment that after the third time Peter denies Jesus, that Jesus would look at him and their eyes would meet. You imagine the hurt that went through Jesus at that moment? Can you imagine the complete brokenness that went through Peter at that moment? You see, Peter had offended Jesus perhaps as greatly as anyone could ever do. I believe Peter thought his life was over. It was destroyed. He thought his usefulness for Jesus was done. I think he believed there was no way he could recover. But then we fast forward after Jesus' resurrection to John chapter 21. And we see one of the most beautiful scenes of forgiveness in all of Scripture. As Jesus is on the shore of the Sea of Galilee, and he has this private, intimate moment with Peter where they talk, and Jesus would challenge him, "Do you love me?" 3 times he would ask the question. Peter says, "You know I love you." Jesus extends that forgiveness, but he doesn't just forgive him. He sets him up to launch him to be one of the greatest ambassadors of kingdom living the world has ever seen. And that forgiveness that Jesus extended completely changed Peter's life. But you see, it's not just the power of Jesus in the moment of the parable or in the moment in Peter's life. It's also the power of Jesus in our lives. You see, we need to see ourselves in this parable. And we need to see how we have hurt Jesus in the same way that Peter did. You see, it's our sins that scarred the back of Jesus from those beatings. It's our sin that hurt God through the damage we did to His Son. But yet, it's Jesus suffering and some of the final words that He uttered on the cross that echo back to this concept of forgiveness. "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." And you see, it's ultimately His blood that forgives us. And so then how do we take that now and live it in our lives? Because let's be honest with each other. It's hard. It is not easy to live this out in our lives because truthfully, we've all been hurt to the point that we have scars from the way that people have hurt us. There are scars that linger, and it's difficult to say, how do we continue to forgive in the way that Jesus calls and challenges us to forgive in this parable? And I think maybe the only way that we can ever get to that point in our lives is by asking ourselves this question: how do we see ourselves? How do we see ourselves? Because you see, if we stop seeing ourselves as the servant that owed a debt that couldn't be repaid in 20 lifetimes, but yet that we've been pardoned, if we stop seeing ourselves that way, then we will never be able to move forward in our forgiveness. You see, Satan, he wants us to think of ourselves, and he wants pride to enter in. And what happens a lot of times is we think we're better than the person that has hurt us. And so because we think we're better, instead of pardoning, what we want to do is maybe at best parole. We'll offer some level of forgiveness, but there's going to be strings attached. And you know what? We'll bring it up from time to time just to make sure that we don't forget and they don't forget. And we'll put walls up that'll say, we'll allow forgiveness to this certain point, but you see, that's not pardoning. That's not what forgiveness means. Pardoning says, I'm wiping it clean. I'm not bringing it up. It goes further than paroling. And so we got to see ourselves. We absolutely have to see ourselves as this first servant. That's the only way we remotely start to be able living out forgiveness in our lives. We have to see ourselves as broken. We have to remember ourselves without Christ and His forgiveness. And we have to see the pity and the mercy and the forgiveness that has been given in our lives. And when we fail to see that, we will never move forward in our ability to forgive others. And it is still going to take work. And there's still hurts that have to be overcome. And I'm not here to tell you that this is an easy formula to follow. I'm simply suggesting this: how we see ourselves matters when it comes to our ability to forgive others. You think about the power of forgiveness. There is something powerful about forgiveness. There's healing in forgiveness. There's healing for us. There's healing for the one that we are forgiving. There's healing for everybody involved. So where does all of this leave us this morning? I guess the first thing I would say is this: it leaves us in a position where we need to praise God for the forgiveness that we have through Christ. for the forgiveness that is available through His blood that He shed on the cross, that He extends to us through His grace and His love and His mercy, for the incredible pity that He has for us, that He continues to have for us. I guess the second thing I would say is this. It challenges us to rethink how we view ourselves and to consider how we can better extend forgiveness to those in our lives. Do you need God's forgiveness this morning? We all do. It's a rhetorical question. But maybe the second part to think about is this. Who do you need to extend forgiveness to in your life this morning? And as we extend the invitation, as we think about leaving here this morning, maybe we can keep those two thoughts in our minds. How much do we need God's forgiveness in our lives? And how better will our lives be if we can extend that forgiveness to others? The Lord's invitation is extended to you this morning. I hope you'll think about the challenges and the blessings that come along with the idea of forgiveness together. If we can help you in any way with your walk with Jesus this morning, just let us know now while together we stand and sing.